Well, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest in the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies series of public lectures. And tonight, again, we're delighted to have Professor Steve Ellner with us again for the second of three events he's doing in Canberra this week. And tonight, he's going to be talking about Venezuela's foreign policy, third world strategy, or megalomania. Now, if you've been reading the Foreign Affairs magazine, journal website, you'll have seen recently there was an article by Michael Shifter talking about this very question: what should you read on Venezuelan foreign policy? And one of the stories he tells is when he was asked to write that article, he had an extremely hard time recommending 10 things to read, to find 10 good things to read. So we've got a bit of a treat tonight. It's very difficult to get good analysis on Venezuelan foreign policy, so I think probably Professor Ellner is uniquely well placed to do this and understands the situation better than most. So this is a bit of an invaluable insight. A bit of the background: Professor Ellner has specialized in organized labor and political parties in Latin America, and specifically Venezuela, where he's lived since 1975. And he's taught at the Universidad de Oriente in Puerto La Cruz in Venezuela and the Universidad Central de Venezuela. He's also, outside Venezuela, been a visiting professor at Georgetown, Duke, Universidad de los Andes, and Universidad de Buenos Aires. He's published numerous books on political behavior in Latin America, which are found in all of the credible library collections, and soon, I hope, ours, once we get the buying process going. He's also published in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, Los Angeles Times. He has put frequent contributions in The Nation, and a wonderful little publication that's not well known called NACO Report on the Americas. All sorts of very interesting stuff in that. Before I turn the floor over to Professor Ellner, just a couple of quick things that are coming up. Tomorrow, there'll be more Professor Ellner. He's going to do a seminar called Venezuela's Radical Social-Based Democracy Model and Latin American Populism. That's going to be upstairs in the L.J. Hume Center at 4:30. The Venezuelan government obviously approves because they've decided that all those who attend can go to the residence, is that correct? Afterwards for drinks and canapes. So some incentive to come out on a Friday afternoon. Next week, we also have a recital of the Argentine Aboriginal vocalist Luisa Cacumil, and she's going to be doing a recital of a series of traditional Mapuche songs and stories. And that's going to be next Thursday, 6:30 in Manning Clark Theater number 3. And then on the 18th of August, Thursday, this is the event that, well, those of us on faculty here have been waiting for a long time. We have the official launch of the Bachelor of Latin American Studies degree at the ANU. So this is the only Latin American Studies degree that you can do in Australia. So we're quite excited for this, and we invite you all along. So as always, the ANCLAS habit, the tradition. After the lecture, which will be about 45 minutes, followed by some questions, there will be time for sort of further informal discussion over a drink and a nibble or two out in the foyer. So we hope you join us there. And I think now, without further ado, Professor Ellner, I'll hand the floor over. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Sean. On Tuesday, for those who were here, and for those who weren't here, I discussed 21st century socialism as applied specifically to the Venezuelan case. And my central argument, my central point, was that the process of far-reaching change in Venezuela is a complex process. And in doing so, I implicitly critiqued what may be called dogmatic Marxism, which focuses on the working class and brushes over or ignores the different internal groups, social groups, political groups within the movement for change, and ignores the tensions, the internal contradictions, the conflicts between those different groups. In addition, I argued that the peaceful democratic road to socialism is much more complex than the socialist strategies of the 20th century, of the Soviet Union, of China, of Cuba, because the democratic, gradual, peaceful road to socialism creates spaces for those different conflicting groups within the camp of the revolutionaries and also within the camp of the opposition. There are more opportunities in both cases. I presented an example of the problem of shortages in Venezuela over the last several years, and how the government reacted to those shortages by establishing price controls, and that created problems, and the government reacted by creating an intricate structure to try to enforce those price controls, and all that led to expropriation. But it was a complex, ongoing process, which you can contrast with the Soviet Union in the 1930s, which was much simpler. There were shortages. The kulak class, the wealthy producers in the countryside, reacted to the government policies of favoring the urban centers over the rural centers and the collectivization of agriculture. They reacted by burning their products and destroying their equipment, and Stalin stepped in and forced them onto labor camps. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, or hundreds of, some say millions, were killed as a result. So that was a simple kind of strategy and a simple kind of cause and effect relationship. Today, I'm going to apply that same idea of complexity to the subject of foreign policy. And I argue also that many of the people who write on Chavez's foreign policy, many of Chavez's detractors, both academic and non-academic, and some of Chavez's followers, simplify the subject of foreign policy. And specifically, I'd like to make reference to a book by somebody who I mentioned on Tuesday, the ex-foreign minister of Mexico, Jorge Castañeda, who wrote a book came out about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, called Leftovers. He's a co-editor of that book. And in it, he talks about a good left and a bad left. Of course, the good left is Lula, and needless to say, the bad left is Chavez. And he applies that to foreign policy, he applies that also to internal policies. And there's a more recent book, Venezuela's Petro-Diplomacy, Hugo Chavez's Foreign Policy, by Ralph Clem and Anthony Meingold, published by the University of Florida International University. That's a recent book, and although not all the chapters are saying the same thing, the basic thrust of the book, and one of the chapters is written by Castañeda himself, is just that Chavez represents the bad left, and what drives Chavez and what drives Chavez's foreign policy, it's all about power for power's sake. Or in a modified version, it's all about anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism for anti-Americanism's sake. I hesitate to use the word America because America takes in all of 2 continents. So to refer to the United States using the word America is somewhat misleading. But anti-Americanism is viewed as a driving force. There's no context, there's no attempt to try to explain why there may be an anti-American sentiment, or whether it's more complex than just plain anti-Americanism. And a third version of the same thesis is that Chavez and the Chavista leaders use foreign policy and use a very emotional kind of style with regard to attacking different targets. The United States, Uribe in the case of Colombia, at one point Alan Garcia in Peru, that those issues are taken up and those targets are established in order to divert attention from internal policies, divert attention from internal issues and pressing needs internally, and to try to convert those issues into voter-getting mechanisms so that the people get riled up and forget about their internal problems, and that way he's able to garner support and garner votes. So I'd like to take issue with that thesis, which I consider to be a simplistic thesis, and try to see things in a broader perspective. Firstly, The theory that Chavez is anti-US just because he's anti-US, or just because he doesn't like the United States, glosses over the issue of, in these tensions between the United States and Venezuela, who started it all? Who threw the first stone? It's just assumed that Chavez attacks the United States for no good reason, and now there are bad relations between the United States and Venezuela. But if you go back, in 1998, actually before Chavez was elected president, during the campaign in 1998, he was elected in December, but prior to that, on 2 occasions, Chavez requested a visa to travel to the United States in order to present his program to the United States, to diplomats, to the political community, and to people in general. And he was denied that visa on 2 different occasions. I remember that Chavez's reaction to that denial, I remember seeing him on TV, and his language was very bland. He stated, the United States has all the right in the world, this is their policy, this is their government, this is their country, and he didn't object to the US denial. This was under the Clinton administration. After he was elected president, the relations between the Clinton administration and Chavez was I would characterize as friendly. There were some concrete differences between the two of them. And there was, you might say, a clash over specific issues, which I won't go into. But the language and the relations in general, and the fact that Chavez met with Clinton, I think on 2 occasions, you could characterize as fairly friendly. Under Bush, beginning in 2001, the relations were friendly until the bombing of Afghanistan. The first time that there was friction that translated itself into aggressive vocabulary or an aggressive kind of reaction was when Chavez criticized the bombing of Afghanistan. He held up a picture. He said, you know, this is the United States' decision to carry out a campaign in Afghanistan, but this is unacceptable. And he held up a picture of children, old people, women who were the victims of U.S. bombings. And the reaction of the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, was Mr. Chavez, U.S. accent, Mr. Chavez doesn't know anything about democracy. So that things took off from there. But throughout 2001 and throughout 2002, Chavez's language towards the United States and Chavez's attitude towards the United States was also bland. In other words, in spite of the fact that the Bush administration started heavily criticizing Chavez on different fronts, on different occasions, even after the coup in April of 2002, when the United States justified the coup, and there was evidence that the United States actually participated or lent support at different levels. We don't know exactly the specifics. But even after the coup in April, in July of 2002, in an interview with the Chilean Marxist activist Marta Harnica, she is Chilean, lived a long time in Cuba, and is now based in Venezuela. I think she's leaving Venezuela now. But she interviewed Chavez, an interview that was published in Spanish. It was published in English by Monthly Review Press. And that interview was in July of 2002. And she asked Chavez about the Office of Transition that was established in that month in the embassy, in the U.S. Embassy in Caracas. Now, political scientists know, and political analysts know, and a lot of people who aren't political analysts know, that transition is a euphemism for regime change. And Chavez's reaction to the question was, oh, we'll have to look into that. In other words, he didn't respond aggressively to the establishment of that office in the embassy in Caracas. His language changed after the general strike of December of 2002, January of 2003, when, as I mentioned briefly on Tuesday, it was a rather traumatic experience for Venezuela. 2 months of shortages, Venezuela had to import oil, and the United States, the attitude of the Bush administration was supportive of the opposition throughout that conflict. And it was after that Chavez began employing the term imperialism and anti-imperialism. So that, the argument that Chavez is anti-American and there's really no sense to it, really ignores the context. In this case, the historical context. The chronology demonstrates that Chavez was not anti-American, at least he didn't manifest anti-American attitudes, anti-American sentiment until 2003. And like I said before, the language of the Bush administration, beginning in late 2001, became rather hostile, rather aggressive. And that continued through the general strike, when the position of the Bush administration was obviously not friendly to the Chavez government. The argument of Castañeda is that because of the anti-American sentiment, that the bad left, Chavez and Morales also in the case of Bolivia, they're jeopardizing the most important market in the world, which is the US market. So that the trade-off is being able to express anti-American sentiment in a cathartic kind of way, and perhaps rallying local support on the basis of a generalized attitude of hostility towards the United States. But the sacrifice is great, and that is that they're putting in danger, they're possibly forfeiting the most important market, that in the case of Venezuela is represents more than 50% of the export of oil. That argument also ignores the fact that, if Castañeda was talking of his own Mexico, that argument would be more credible, because there is, for historical reasons, much anti-US sentiment in Mexico, and the argument that a politician is using that anti-American sentiment, or articulating anti-American sentiment, in order to cash in on people's attitudes and profit at the polls, might be credible in the case of Mexico, but not in the case of Venezuela. I think Venezuela is perhaps the least anti-American historically, and up until the present, is the least anti-American nation in Latin America. I've lived there since 1975, and that has definitely been my impression, that Venezuelans are not particularly anti-American, as is the case of in countries like Mexico. I think that a much better starting point in order to understand Venezuelan foreign policy, rather than anti-Americanism, rather than power for power's sake, or rather than some kind of maneuver to take attention away from internal problems. I think a much better place to begin, as a point of departure, is the concept that Chavez formulated from the very outset, but not in the context of an anti-American, anti-US discourse. But that was the concept of a multipolar world. Chavez began talking of a multipolar world from the very outset. And multipolar world means that a world dominated by one power is not beneficial. That it would be much healthier for the world as a whole and for individual countries to establish different blocks of nations. And in the case of Venezuela, you could think in terms of the OPEC bloc of, in those days, 10 nations that belonged to OPEC, now a few more. The South American bloc, the Latin American bloc, Mercosur, these are different blocks. And according to the concept of multipolar world, the idea is that these countries strengthen the unity among them, present a common front, develop common programs and common policies. And so this happens throughout the world. Europe has the European Union, the Asian countries do the same, and the Latin American countries do the same. And so you have somewhat of an equilibrium or a balance of power. You might say that multipolar world was a euphemism for anti-imperialism, but that term wasn't used by Chavez back in 1999. The term wasn't used, and the connotations behind the term wasn't a part of Chavez's discourse. And I think the concept of multipolar world is important, is beneficial, is helpful. In order to understand certain situations which don't get well developed and well analyzed in the media. For instance, the relations between Venezuela and Iran. The concept of a multipolar world, and let me say before I talk about that the multipolar world concept really has its origins in the non-aligned movement of the countries of the South, beginning in the 50s or especially the early 60s, when prestigious third world leaders like Nkrumah, Nehru, Tito, Nasser got together and decided that if the South was going to advance its own agenda and was going to present demands and programs and face the North as a bloc, because of the great diversity in the South, both politically, ethnically, ideologically, religiously, that it was necessary to put aside all those factors that divided all those nations and just devise programs and focus on those programs. So that I think the multipolar world concept that Chavez has promoted really has historical roots going back to the 50s or 60s. And that idea that differences have to be marginalized in order to benefit mutually, I think is applied. And in the case of Iran, there are differences between Iran and Venezuela, but the concept that those differences should not get in the way of mutual programs that benefit the countries mutually, and also that, and here's another element in the concept of multipolar world, the element of sovereignty, that nations should face their problems, their internal problems internally, and other nations should not get involved. Castaneda takes issue with that concept in all his writing, going back to when he himself was a leftist in the 90s, and his book in the early 90s actually, Utopia Unarmed, which he published in 93. And as a leftist, he presented the same notion that in the world of globalization, that nations cannot avoid being evaluated, being judged by international bodies. In other words, Castaneda was defending globalization and its spin-off concept of multilateral intervention in countries when democracy is failing. And Chavez is opposed to that. So that the multipolar world concept emphasizes sovereignty over globalization and multilateral bodies that evaluate the democratic performance of individual nations, and also states that differences between nations should not interfere with programs and alliances between them. So that, I think in that context, we can tackle the issue of Venezuela's relations with Iran. The media doesn't talk about this. I haven't seen it, at least. I may be wrong, but I've never seen the media talk about Venezuela's policy towards Israel in terms of Israel's right to exist. But Chavez has been accused of being anti-Semitic, and I won't get into that at all, because that's involves a lot of detail. But one of the arguments used by those who accuse Chavez of being anti-Semitic is that, well, any friend of Ahmadinejad has to be anti-Semitic because Ahmadinejad denies the Holocaust and Ahmadinejad wants to drive Israel into the sea. But the fact of the matter is that that's not Chavez's position. Chavez states that Israel is a sovereign nation and it has a right to exist as a nation. Venezuela is very critical of Israel's policy towards the Palestinian people and towards the in the Middle East, but he recognizes Israel's right to exist. So I think that that's a good example of this concept of multipolar world and how it plays out in a specific case. The multipolar thrust, the attempt to establish close relations with other countries regardless of their ideological and political orientation, I think is important in terms of economic policy because it's part of a strategy of diversifying commercial and technological relations. And it plays out specifically in the case of the exploitation of oil in the vast reserves, which may be the biggest reserves in the world, in the Faja de Orinoco, where the government, the state oil company PDVSA, has created 27 blocks and has assigned these blocks to different companies in different countries to carry out preliminary exploration in order to determine the amount of oil, the amount of reserves that are there. And at the same time that that was undertaken in, I think, around 2007, the government implemented a policy that I discussed on Tuesday, stemming from the Ley Orgánica de Hidrocarburos. I think I stated on Tuesday that law stated that more than 50% of the ownership of all mixed companies had to be controlled by PDVSA, by the state oil company. And in 2007, after Chavez was re-elected president in December of 2006, Chavez increased that percentage to 60%. Went from 50% plus 1 to 60%. And a number of other changes in oil policy involving the incorporation of all the workers on the payroll of PDVSA. In other words, the different mixed companies, each one had its own workforce. As of 2007, the government placed all those workers on the payroll of the state oil company. It was a risky decision because it was controversial. The oil companies, the private multinationals, didn't like it. But on the other hand, the biggest reserves possibly in the world are in the Faja de Orinoco. So Chavez had that advantage in negotiating with the multinational oil companies. But two big oil companies, big worldwide and big in Venezuela, Conoco, Phillips, and Exxon, which is the biggest of them all, left Venezuela. But Chevron, Texaco, which is also a big oil company, and other BP to a lesser extent, Total, which is a French company, State Oil, which is a Norwegian company, and a number of other multinational companies stayed in Venezuela. And perhaps one of the reasons they stayed, at least this was the strategy that was designed by the PDVSA heads, was that Venezuela had options. Because at the same time that it was modifying oil policy, it was also reaching agreements with oil companies throughout the world, third world oil companies, mainly state oil companies, assigning them these blocks, among these 27 blocks. They were getting assigned individual blocks. Vietnam, one or perhaps several Chinese oil companies, I think two Russian oil companies, the Brazilian oil company, an Argentine oil company, state oil company, Iran, Belarus, a number of countries, the state oil company was given one block to engage in preliminary oil drilling in order to provide estimates of the amount of oil that is in that block. Now, obviously, that agreement, that contract to explore, open the possibility, was an opportunity for those oil companies to possibly continue to explore and then exploit the oil. That possibility existed, it still exists. And that was the strategy. And so in the tug of war with the multinational oil companies, Venezuela was able to say, or implicitly state, or explicitly state, look, we have alternatives. There are other countries, other governments, other companies that are interested in our oil. So I think that the multi-world strategy based on diversification, I think that this is another aspect of multi-world, multipolar world, diversification. I think that strategy played out in the case of the Faja de Orinoco. It didn't work out in the case of ConocoPhillips, and it didn't work out in the case of Exxon, but it worked out in the case of other multinational oil companies that are in Venezuela. And the same strategy of diversification was applied in the case of Petrocaribe. The block of nations, now a little bit more than 15 Caribbean, Central American nations, in which Venezuela provides oil under favorable credit terms, in which, at least at first, 40% of the oil, 40% of the price of the oil was paid back to Venezuela on very bland credit terms over a period of 25 years, 1% interest rates. And the possibility existed that those countries, such as in the case of Cuba, pay that oil back not in dollars or not in currency, but in goods and services. That's the case of Cuba with the Cuban doctors who are in Venezuela working in the Barrio Dentro program. So that this arrangement has been very much criticized within Venezuela. In fact, the opposition slogan is, and during the presidential campaign in 2006, the opposition candidate Manuel Rosales, declared, we are not going to give away any more oil. But the fact of the matter is that Venezuela is not giving away oil. In fact, it can, under the terms of OPEC, as long as it's a member of OPEC. OPEC doesn't allow Venezuela to give away oil. The arrangement is, or was, 60% upfront and 40% over a period of 25 years. So Venezuela wasn't giving away the oil. But I think that the opposition's criticism of the program was furthered by the Chavista discourse. I think that the Chavistas knowingly or unknowingly played into the hands of the opposition, because the justification for the program on the part of Chavez and on the part of any government leader who talks about Petrocaribe is that this is an example of solidarity. That Venezuela solidarity is essential. It's part of ALBA, which is an arrangement involving Venezuela's closer allies, namely Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, as well as a few Caribbean nations. And that's based on the idea of solidarity. It's a whole different concept. It's not a commercial concept. And the Chavistas and Chavez himself, when he explained Petrocaribe, he always emphasized solidarity. But there's another argument in favor of Petrocaribe that was, I would say, overshadowed by the solidarity argument. And that is that it was a viable commercial strategy. In fact, companies could very easily, it's very easy to imagine that a company would establish similar arrangements in order to diversify, in order to establish themselves in new markets. After all, these Central American countries, a lot of South American countries, Venezuela, in spite of the proximity, doesn't have any commercial arrangements. Has never sold oil to countries like Uruguay, for instance. Oil was never sold to Uruguay in spite of the proximity. And the same with Central America and the Caribbean. So that a cogent defense of that program would be that this is a commercial strategy designed to promote diversification. And after all, Venezuela is benefiting because it's receiving 60% of the money up front. It's benefiting because the 40% could be in the form of barter that doesn't go through middle people. And specifically in the case of Cuba, the Barrio Dentro program of mainly Cuban doctors working out of the poor barrios, well, that's what the program is called, Barrio Dentro, is very popular in Venezuela. Even the opposition supports it up front. So that there were other ways to defend and other ways to win public opinion over to Petrocaribe. But the Chavez government emphasizes the term solidarity. I won't go into any detail on that, just to say, and perhaps on Friday, tomorrow, I'll be talking about this, that there are different currents within the Chavez movement, and those currents have different discourses, different outlooks, and there are internal differences that explain these two different sets of justifications for Petrocaribe. One which emphasizes cultural transformation, in this case, solidarity. The other that emphasizes, look, socialism is allegedly superior to capitalism. It does better on the economic front. So that more pragmatic line of reasoning was downplayed by the Chavez government. I think that the multipolar world strategy has developed over these 12 years. And even though the Chavista government has gone through different stages and there's been a radicalization process that has culminated recently with these mass expropriations of medium-sized and large companies and strategic companies that I discussed on Tuesday, nevertheless, the foreign policy, and specifically the policy towards the rest of Latin America, has moved in the direction of consensus. And I think that this is interesting because, you know, at first, Chavez maintained very close friendly relations with the countries that Castaneda is calling the good left, namely Lula, Kirchner, although Castaneda calls Kirchner the bad left. I won't get into that. But he's certainly a moderate than the Kirchners. Now, Cristina Kirchner, they're moderates. They're not social. They don't talk about socialism. But Chavez has maintained very good relations with those moderate left governments, Uruguay, Paraguay, El Salvador, which has turned out to be a moderate left government. So Venezuela has good relations, and especially with Lula. Chavez and Lula are good buddies. But at the same time, Chavez was pretty hostile towards Vicente Fox, who was a conservative when he was president, was quite conservative, quite anti-leftist. His discourse was, and even now, and now even more so, anti-left. But in the case of Alan Garcia, also, Chavez, when the elections took place, the previous elections took place between Alan Garcia and Ollanta Humala, Chavez stated, and I think it was a big mistake on the part of Chavez, my wife does also, because I remember seeing this on TV and the two of us were just horrified, that Chavez said, you know, if Alan Garcia is elected president, we're going to think in terms of severing diplomatic relations with Peru. Maybe it was a spontaneous kind of thing that he said, maybe it wasn't thought out, but in any case it did a lot of damage to Venezuela and Venezuela's relations with Peru. But, and once Garcia was elected president, the relations between Garcia and Chavez, those relations were decent, but there was that initial period in which Chavez made that statement, and that seemed to indicate a differentiation between the conservative governments or the non-leftist governments in Latin America, such as Mexico and Peru on the one hand, and Uribe also. The relations between Chavez and Uribe had incredible ups and downs, but differentiating those with Chavez's relations with the moderate left, which have always been good relations, and special relations with the fellow leftist governments of Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But more recently, things have moved in another interesting direction. And that interesting direction was signaled by events in Bolivia when Morales assumed the presidency and nationalized, although it really wasn't nationalization, but it was state control over the hydrocarbon industry. And there was a clash between the interests of Bolivia and the interests of Brazil, whose state oil company, semi-state oil company, had heavy investments in those fields. And there was the beginning of a sense of international cooperation, which Brazil, under Lula, Argentina, which also has close commercial ties with Bolivian gas, depends on Bolivian gas, under Nestor Kirchner, and under Chavez, those countries came together and resolved that problem. And later on, when there was a bloody confrontation in the eastern part of Bolivia, UNASUR, which takes in all of South America, the entire continent, including Chile, which was then under the socialist government of Bachelet, but all the countries insisted on the defense of the democratic stability and rallied behind Morales. And more recently, the decision on the part of Chavez to agree to the readmission of Honduras into the OAS under certain conditions, including the return of Zelaya and the guaranteeing of Zelaya's physical integrity in Honduras, was a real surprise move. But it was set up by Chavez and Santos. When Santos was elected president, everybody thought that relations between Venezuela and Colombia, which had reached rock bottom, would stay there, because Santos was considered even more militaristic. After all, he had been Uribe's defense minister and took credit, quote unquote, for the incursion onto territory in Ecuador, so that everybody thought that relations would really stagnate between the two countries, and just the reverse happened. And Chavez and Santos brokered a deal that involved Celaya and involved the government of Honduras under Lobo. So that I think that this is part of a new trend which promotes the concept of a multipolar world that goes beyond political and ideological differences in a big way. UNASUR is now being transformed into CELAC, which is an organization that takes in all of Latin America, and which is considered, at least the journalistic reports talk about a shadow OAS. And there's all kinds of speculation about what CELAC is going to mean for the OAS. On the basis of interviews, one interview that I carried out with the Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations, it's evident that different Latin American countries have different notions of whether CELAC is going to compete, whether it's going to coexist, whether it's going to be complementary to the OAS. But Venezuela's position is that it all depends on the OAS. If the OAS continues to take positions which other countries might object to, if it doesn't play a strong enough role in defense of the type of sovereignty that Venezuela is promoting, then CELAC would be promoted as an alternative to the OAS. And of course that excludes the United States and excludes Canada. But what is interesting is that this project for a Latin American bloc is being actively supported. I say actively because countries that you would think would be in the pro-US camp are participating in this project, namely Chile, under Piñera, and Mexico, but specifically Chile, which is going to host CELAC next year, so that this is a type of unity that goes beyond the unity of the moderate left and the hard left, the unity of the bad left and the good left, to use Castaneda's terms. It goes beyond that. And I think it's an interesting and important development. This, I think, has important implications for Latin America. And I think it could possibly move in many directions. And I'll just end on this note. It's exactly 45 minutes, so that's what you said, right? 45 minutes, was that?
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm nearing the end here. I think it is instructive to compare international relations and Venezuela's relations with the rest of Latin America and Venezuela's strategy with Cuba's relations with Latin America in the 1960s. Because in the case of Cuba, Cuba followed a bottom-up approach. Cuba tried to establish ties with social and especially political movements throughout Latin America, and pretty much ignored or didn't devote much attention to the importance of relations, country-country, government-government relations, and ended up promoting materially and otherwise guerrilla movements throughout Latin America. And in doing so, Cuba forfeited establishing good relations with moderate countries in Latin America. Like, for instance, Frondizi, in the case of Argentina. When the United States, under Kennedy, tried to isolate Cuba and carry out commercial measures against Cuba, expel Cuba from the OAS, and the decision to sever commercial relations with Cuba, Kennedy considered that it was very important for the United States to have the democratic nations of Latin America on board. In fact, he pretty much stated that he wouldn't go along with this otherwise. This was a time in which there were a number of coups throughout Latin America, and so Kennedy paid special importance, the Kennedy administration paid special importance to the democratic countries, such as Venezuela. Well, Venezuela was on board from the beginning under Ramon Betancourt, but Frondizi, in the case of Argentina, in the case of Chile, which was democratic, in the case of Brazil, which was also democratic until 1964. And those countries wavered. In fact, in the case of Frondizi told the Kennedy administration at first that he couldn't go along with measures to expel and to ostracize Cuba because of the pressure within his country. And so the fact that Cuba followed a policy of promoting 1, 2, 3 Vietnams in Latin America, that was the famous slogan of Che Guevara in the 1960s, really sacrificed the possibility of a diplomatic strategy that could have defeated the Kennedy administration's effort to isolate Cuba. Compare that with the close relations between Chavez and Lula. I mean, for Chavez, for somebody who is talking about socialism, Lula is really the same kind of moderate that Frondizi perhaps was in the context of the early 1960s. At the World Social Forum at Porto Alegre, where Chavez declared himself a socialist in January of 2005, Lula was up on stage with Chavez, and when Lula spoke first, and there was a negative reaction among many of the Brazilians who tended to be the leftists, who were very critical of Chavez for not pursuing more radical policies, more anti-neoliberal policies, and he got booed. And when Chavez stood up, he said, you know, I don't go along with this. Lula is a good man. Those were his words. Lula is a good man. Lula is my friend. And he's doing a good job, and I support him all the way. And I think that has been typical of Chavez's language towards the heads of states of other countries, the moderate leftist countries, even moderate leftists who have been critical of Chavez and have been critical of Venezuela and state in no uncertain terms in response to the accusations of the media and the accusations of the opposition in their country that their country is going to become another Venezuela, or their country is going to be controlled by Venezuela, is going to be a puppet of Venezuela, and they react by saying, we don't have anything to do with Venezuela. And in some cases, in the case of El Salvador at least, in the case of López Obrador in Mexico, in the case of Uruguay, sometimes the language has been not particularly friendly towards Venezuela, but nevertheless, the relations between the two governments in each case is quite friendly. So that I think that it's instructive to make that comparison between the Cuban strategy throughout Latin America in the 1960s and the Chavez strategy throughout these 12 years. And I think that that strategy of good, friendly relations with the moderate left has now expanded to a strategy of Latin American unity, which takes in countries that are conservative, that are even considered to the right, as in the case of Chile under Piñera. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ellner, for that. There's a lot of food for thought there. You've got a very comprehensive, wide, sweeping survey of what Chavez has been up to in foreign policy. And having seen events take place at an OAS General Assembly, there's a lot of tension in what you've been talking about too, which does come up quite clearly. Before I open the floor to questions, I'd just like to recognize the ambassador from Venezuela, Nelson Davia, who's joined us here today. And perhaps you want to have a question or two or some comments as well to add into things. So I'll open it to the floor right now for questions.
I was just wondering about the relationship between Venezuela and Colombia. You mentioned that they have some trade on the border and revolutionary people part as well. I was just wondering how the thoughts were.
Could you formulate your question again, please?
I was wondering about the relationship between Venezuela and Colombia. I know the change of government in Colombia and whether there was tension between the two countries.
Okay, well, you know, as I stated in my presentation, it was kind of surprising that from the very outset, Santos and Chavez developed good relations. They met several times. They agreed to settle a technical economic problem with regard to trade. And that was really one of the big issues. That trade between Colombia and Venezuela is very important, especially for Colombia. Venezuela, I think, is the second biggest recipient of Colombian goods after the United States. And there was some question as to credit that was hanging over that trade, that was suspended, pretty much suspended during the last months of the Uribe administration. And so that problem was resolved. And the other issue, which is a really knotty issue, has to do with the FARC, with the guerrilla movement in Colombia. Many of you might know about the famous computer of the FARC guerrilla leader, Reis, who was killed when Colombia bombed a FARC encampment in Ecuador, and they discovered a computer, and the computer allegedly had messages from the Venezuelan government with regard to material support. I personally can only hypothesize because you don't have the facts, there's been a lot written on this, but the only thing that I will say about this is that my father taught me that if you don't have the facts, or if you have few facts, you can use logic to try to reach tentative conclusions. And so my conclusion is only tentative. But that's based on the idea, the assumption, which may be false, may be true, may be somewhere in between, that none of the actors in Venezuela, in Colombia, the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan opposition, none of them are dumb. They're all smart. They wouldn't be there if they had some kind of intelligence gap. And it is well known that there is surveillance with regard to telephone conversations and with regard to the internet. This became an issue in U.S. politics, and the equivalent of our Secretary of State, the Minister of Interior, Rodriguez Chacín, is a very, in my opinion, very intelligent person. I find it hard to believe that an intelligent person and a knowledgeable person would be sending emails to a guerrilla movement talking about material aid, material support for their activities. But that's on the basis of logic. And you'd have to really delve into the technical arguments on both sides in order to draw a conclusion. But the fact of the matter is that that became a big issue, and it created great tensions between the two countries. One of the aspects of that issue, which got passed over in the debate, is that when Chavez was accused of providing material support for the guerrilla movement, the fact of the matter is that Chavez has always been critical of the FARC. He hasn't always expressed it, but at times he has. And under Pastrana, when Pastrana was president prior to Uribe, I remember him coming out with a statement saying, you know, I don't understand these guys, you know, there are negotiations between the Pastrana administration and the guerrillas are shooting people. Doesn't make sense. I don't really understand where you're at. And at different times, he stated that guerrilla warfare in the 21st century is really obsolete. That was, I think, a word that he used. So that more recently, Chavez did something, this is now under Santos, which has generated considerable controversy, even within especially within the Chavez movement, and that is that a supporter of the FARC, based in Sweden, who lives in Sweden, who's actually a Sweden citizen, but of Colombian, who traveled to Sweden over a decade ago, and forms part of the FARC network in Europe, traveled to Venezuela. And Chavez turned him over, the Chavez government turned him over to the Colombian government. Perhaps as a warning to other members of the FARC that Chavez does not want to use Venezuelan territory for, purposes of military purposes, what have you. So that generated considerable controversy within the Chavista movement. Without going into that debate, I see that decision on the part of Chavez as part of this strategy involving Latin American unity that goes beyond the radical and the moderate left, taking in countries like Colombia, which are conservative, right-wing countries. The fact that Venezuela is now cooperating with Colombia on this issue of the FARC guerrillas in Venezuelan territory, I think represents is part of this new development in Latin American relations.
Hi. I'm confused as to how Chavez can relate to right-wing governments in South America. In particular, Chile, considering how our President Ellner has such a market-based mentality and is well known for his neoliberal mentality. And to him, things like education and health are merchandise rather than civil rights. I'm just confused how Chavez can relate to a government such as that without being considered by the media as a hypocrite.
Well, consider the alternative. Consider the alternative. What would a given leftist government that wants to avoid the Cuban predicament of being isolated internationally, much to the doing of the United States, but nevertheless isolated internationally over such an extended period of time? Venezuela's strategy, perhaps Chavez has been counseled by Fidel Castro, but because Fidel Castro is much more pragmatic now than he was in the 60s. But Chavez's strategy from the very beginning was to avoid isolation. Would it be more fruitful from a political viewpoint and from Venezuela's viewpoint? Let's forget about the fact that you might be a leftist in a given country and you're thinking of your country rather than Venezuela. But thinking in terms of Venezuela specifically. What would be the case if placing my wife in the same category, we consider to be a blunder when Chavez made that statement about Alan Garcia being elected president. If Chavez were to follow that strategy and that style in every encounter with every country throughout the world and made that differentiation between a country whose government is right-wing. I mean, if what you're saying is viable, then OPEC would cease to exist. Because there isn't any country in the world that is right-wing, if you consider right going back in time, than Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is the essential country in OPEC. Without Saudi Arabia, OPEC doesn't function. So I think there are different ways to look at that.
So his attitude is more of a, just maintain things. Like, I don't know. The way I've seen Chavez being criticized by the media is they've just called him a hypocrite a lot of times. And maybe the way he's trying to govern is just keep things the way they are and not cause the trouble that Cuba did. Well, not trouble, but controversy that Cuba did in the 60s. Maybe that's his way of going about things, just keeping things the way they are, not cause too much controversy because that's the way things fall.
Well, I don't know. It's relative. It's relative because Venezuela's position, for instance, on a number of international issues, for instance, Israel's invasion of the Gaza, was very outspoken, extremely outspoken. So obviously, Chavez is not shying away from controversy. but I think that there are other objectives as well. And in this case, the objective is Latin American unity, and Latin American unity is conceived of as more important than, let's say if you're a leftist and you want to weigh the two sides, and you say from a leftist viewpoint, is the Latin American unity that Chavez is promoting more important? Are we going to score more points with Chavez doing that than with Chavez attacking Piñera like he attacked Alan Garcia?
The front.
Yes, I'm very well aware of the campaign of fear that the ultra-right in El Salvador against Venezuela during the electoral period, the last presidential election. The fear from the right was that if the people was going to vote for the left candidate, then El Salvador would be falling under Chavez dictatorship, and but apart, that is a comment just in relation to what you made at the end about the fear of the Chavez movement. But my question is about the financial policy from Chavez towards the South American countries or economies. And through the media 4 years ago, more or less, or 5, I read that Chavez was supporting the Argentinians and all the governments during the bad financial situation. I'm wondering whether that support from Chavez has saved Latin American countries from the financial crisis that European economies are facing now. Can you please, because I said I read it through the media,
Right.
but I don't have a very deep knowledge about
Right.
that policy.
Yeah, that was, in the first year or two of the government of Ernesto Kirchner, in which Venezuela bought bonds that helped Argentina in a very difficult economic situation. I don't know that Venezuela is doing that. I think Venezuela's biggest act of solidarity from an economic viewpoint is Petrocaribe at this point, because they're the poorer countries of the Caribbean and Central America, and it provides them with much needed oil. And it's, I think, it's a very important program. As a matter of fact, it's so important that recently, in the last month, information has been revealed about how the United States is trying to sabotage Petrocaribe, in the specific case of Haiti. WikiLeaks turned over to a Haitian publication the cables involving the U.S. diplomats in Haiti. And incidentally, the second biggest U.S. embassy in the world, surprisingly enough, after Iraq, is in Haiti. And the cables demonstrate, they're interesting, and they're really ludicrous, if not pathetic, because the diplomats say in these cables, of course the diplomats didn't know that these cables were going to be open to the public, but they say in the communications with Washington, really, Petrocaribe is beneficial for Haiti, and we couldn't think of any argument in trying to win over the government of Haiti to the idea of rejecting Petrocaribe, to the idea of not entering Petrocaribe. We couldn't think of any argument from Haiti's viewpoint And so we ended up telling the Haitian government, look, we don't like Petrocaribe because it's not in our interests. Imagine that, the poorest country in Latin America. And the argument of the United States was, don't go along with Petrocaribe because it's not in our interests. That's what those cables stated. But it's interesting because, firstly, it shows the importance that the United States attaches to Petrocaribe, the importance of the program for Central America and the Caribbean. And secondly, the U.S. reaction to Venezuelan foreign policy.
Argentine bonds, the trick is always look at the terms of the contract, because that was a very canny capitalist investment by Chavez. It wasn't a giveaway. They did really quite well out of those. It was a very, nobody else was lending the money, but the terms were pretty good for him, not for them.
Yes, and I also read that it was to, in Spanish, is contrarrest the influence of the World Bank that was struggling.
Yeah, they couldn't get money at all, so it was a key time, but the terms were pretty good. Yeah. Yes, yep.
I want to recall that maybe 3 months ago, a professor from Mexico, former advisor of President Chávez, was here giving us a very good conference on his point of view of stuff. And he said that President Chávez was a clown, a payaso. Yeah? That usually the right-wing politicians in Latin America, when they don't like a person who is left-wing, or even moderate left-wing, call them payasos. And I suppose in 2 or 3 more months they are going to call Presidente Ollanta another payaso. Then, first thing. The second thing is the President Chávez, I have been observing his, more or less his government, has a lot of similarities with the presidency of Salvador Allende in Chile, especially the economical measures, the pressure the president got as well, and fortunately, in the 21st century, the concept of democracy has evolved a little bit in Latin America. My question is, what is going to happen about Venezuela after Chavez? President Chavez, unfortunately, is sick. Who knows what is going to happen in the next 2, 3, 5, or 6 years? Do you think it's going to be Chavismo after Chavez?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I was asked a similar question on Tuesday, and my feeling is that for 2 reasons. I think that Chavismo is here to stay. On the other hand, it's undeniable, I don't think anybody would say differently, that Chavez is a key figure, is an extremely important figure. Without him, things wouldn't be the same. And I did state on Tuesday, and I've stated on interviews with the media, that I can see 3 scenarios for 2012. One is, if Chavez recovers, he'll probably win the elections. If he doesn't, if he's out of the picture, if anything happens to him in a serious way, the Chavistas will probably not win. I find it hard to imagine that they would. But an in-between scenario in which Chavez is weakened as a result of his sickness, his problem, but was able to communicate publicly and make his opinions heard. There's a sense of loyalty within the Chavez movement, and whatever candidate Chavez supported would have a possibility of winning. I'm not saying that candidate would win, but they wouldn't be out of the race completely. So those are the 3 scenarios for 2012. But looking ahead, I think that 2 things. One is, you know, if we're talking of the 1960s and 70s, I would say Chavismo without Chavez would not get any place. That, you know, the old hegemonic forces would reestablish themselves, and there wouldn't be anything permanent in a situation like this that's so dependent on one leader. But the fact of the matter is that there is somewhat of a vacuum because the opposition is extremely weak. And as I said on Tuesday, I believe that the opposition is extremely weak, not because the opposition is incompetent, but because it's a reflection of something that's happening on the world scale involving capitalism and democracy. The center-left space, politically, has pretty much evaporated in Venezuela, in the United States, and a lot of countries. And without that space, the possibility that the opposition could challenge Chavismo without Chavez and reestablish its hegemony is unlikely because it's a legitimacy question. The opposition does not have a sense of legitimacy. The people, even the people who hate Chavez, will say they don't want to return to pre-1998 years for anything in this world. So that the opposition, which hasn't defined a different strategy, the opposition that's identified with the so-called Fourth Republic, in other words, Venezuela in the 1980s and 90s, that opposition is not going to be easily able to regain the hearts and minds of the Venezuelan people and displace Chavismo. So I think that for that reason, and also the second factor is the learning experience, the sense of empowerment, the cultural transformation that has taken place during these 12 years, I think is also a permanent change in Venezuelan politics.
Last question.
I think this is sort of related to the previous question. You've mentioned a few times, well, you've hinted at there being different sort of currents within the Chavez movement. How much is the foreign policy of Venezuela Chavez's brainchild, and how much of it is, how much are there different countervailing views? Are there other people who are pushing the foreign policy within the government? And how does that contrast to the internal policy of Venezuela? Maybe that's a whole other question.
Well, okay, I can talk about the second half of the question, because with regard to foreign policy, these internal currents in Venezuela do not reflect itself on the international stage. I couldn't really talk about international currents as it applies to foreign policy. But with regard to the Chavista movement, I believe that there are three different social blocks: the working class, the non-incorporated sectors, and the middle class. And I think that the differences in discourse and the clashes that take place within the Chavez movement, the tensions that exist, have a social base and are related to those three social groups. And I'll just give you one example of how that plays out on a daily basis. I'll give you two examples. One is there is an attitude of sharp criticism towards the labor unions on the part of a lot of Chavistas. And that manifests itself in the case of the community councils, which have a problem with when they get a contract for public works in their community. They have money to carry out a given project. The construction workers union goes into the community and insists that they get a certain number of positions, that their people go to work on that project. And so what the community councils have done, sometimes advised by the state officials, is they would prefer, they try to carry out that project on their own with their own workers rather than turning that project over to a company. In other words, contracting a company, because the company is more vulnerable to the pressure of the union, which sometimes uses strong-armed tactics, threats, and sometimes there's violence because they threaten the community, insisting that their people, but in some cases it's blackmail, and in some cases there are organizations that call themselves construction union, but it is really somewhat of a mafia outfit. But in any case, there is an anti-union sentiment. And you hear people say, you know, we want to get around the union, and so we would prefer to do the job ourselves rather than contracting a company that is going to be pressured and blackmailed by the union. So that's one example. And the other example with regard to these tensions within the Chavez movement, a lot of Chavistas criticize programs that, or giveaways that Chavez, programs that are perceived to be giveaways, in which people say poor people are getting money just as a subsidy. It doesn't work out that way. It's more complex. For instance, they'll get money as a scholarship to enroll in the Misión Barrio, the Misión Sucre, the Misión Rivas, or the literacy program. But a lot of people perceive it as a subsidy, as a dole. And so that's an example of different viewpoints within the Chavez movement between the non-incorporated sectors who love Chavez because they're getting financial support to study, and middle-class Chavistas, say, who view that as a giveaway and people getting money for nothing.
That, thank Professor Ellner for a very detailed and comprehensive view of of how Venezuela under Chavez has been planning its foreign policy. This kind of thing is very difficult to figure out without getting down into the weeds. It's too easy to sit back and, God forbid, read the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times and make your decisions based on that. And if we did that, then everybody except for probably Piñera would be in the garbage bin. So please join me in thanking Professor Ellner for the speech. And continuing discussion on slightly less formally, if you'd like to join us outside for refreshment.
Well, that makes it even better. That makes it agree with that.